Hello, and thank you for tuning into my presentation today. My name is Cindy Wilhelm, and I'm a PhD researcher at UEA. I'm happy to present my current work in progress with you that in some way or another is finding its way into articles at the moment. This presentation that I recorded for the conference Extraction, Tracing the Veins carries the title The Future of Extractive Industries, Understanding and Analyzing Mining Sector Reforms in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm looking forward to your engagement and fruitful discussions that will follow after my presentation, hopefully. The structure of this presentation is as follows. First, I will give you some context about the evolution of extractivism and the challenge of inclusive resource-based development, what I like to call the extraction puzzle. Then I will introduce reforms in Sub-Saharan Africa and a particular popular set of reforms, so-called local content policies. I will then introduce my case study, the implementation of local content policies in Guinea's bauxite industry. This will be followed up by a discussion where I look at the implications for the future of inclusive resource-based development. And then, of course, this will be wrapped up by a conclusion. So in my understanding of extractivism, to give you a bit of context, I draw on typical extractivism literature following Godinez, Acosta, and Sampa. They define extractivism as the process to exploit nature and turn it into commercial value for the accumulation of capital. The characteristics are a high volume and intensity of extraction, no or low processing, and at least 50% of the resources are exported. Extractivism changed over time in its intensity, use of technology, purpose, etc. So classical extractivism before the 1970s was shaped by this idea of developmentalism, where the intervention of the state in economic and social institutions in order to achieve development was integral. This included a kind of Rostovian idea of catching up and modernization. This period included high degrees of state intervention ownership, as well as the goal to achieve diversification, linkages, and spillovers. Linkages and spillovers, following Hirschman and to some extent also Singer, draw on the idea that extractive activities are phenomena where one thing leads to another, and the mere activity of extraction unfolds many more activities to enable resource extraction and process the resources further, so create linkages, and some more impacts from mining activities that should then spill over into other areas. So then we saw stagflation in the 1970s and the debt crisis in the 1980s, and arguably this brought then the end of developmentalism and was then replaced by what Brandt, Dietz, and Lang call new world market-oriented developmentalism, or an era of neoliberalism. Power was then handed over to the market. We saw deregulation, we saw privatization, and the purpose of extractivism shifted to attract rather foreign direct investment combined with structural adjustment, to increase the, let's call it, quantitative benefits of extractivism. And this then also now includes state withdrawal. So whereas in the previous period, the state has been very dominant in extractive activities, now it kind of withdraws. Legitimacy is handed over to the private sector, and we see open market policies. By the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, then, we witness a crisis of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. So poverty, inequality, and the promises of neoliberalism do not seem to have materialized, and Bonnie Campbell has done considerable amount of work on this. Seemingly new types of extractivism then emerge across Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is often referred to now as neo-extractivism, or new type of extractivism. And Burkhardt and Dietz, they define the elements of neo-extractivism as first, the regulation of the economies of extraction, B, revenue management and mediation of different interests. 3, and this is very important now, development through addressing the social question and supporting development projects in the region, and political legitimacy creation. So we see now a return of the state and a return of this idea of developmentalism. So the next step now, so this is, we could say, this is kind of the era that we're in right now, so neo-extractivism. And then the literature kind of points out to a potential future that might await us post-extractivism. So the next step then might be to move beyond the narrative of extractivism, developmentalism, and point out rather to the inherent criticism of extractivism and developmentalism and ideas of resource-based development. But we will revisit this a bit later on. Before moving on, another thing I would like to note here is that extractivism literature is heavily dominated by observations from Latin America. This analysis of extractivism only mentions briefly on sidelines that the same observations or similar experiences can be seen elsewhere. However, drawing on Childs and Hearns, Bevington, Campbell, Saunders, and Carmento, and also my own study of the history of mining in Guinea, I argue that the same evolution can be seen across Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, browsing through extractivism literature, what is clear is that extractivism in itself is continuously connected to negative impacts. If we look at the resource curse debate that you might be familiar with, so the arguments by people like Auty, Saxon Warner, Collier, and Höfler, that state that there is evidence actually that resource-rich countries are confronted with a curse, that they're more likely to suffer from negative economic, social, and political impacts. And similarly, Ferguson's enclave extractivism that shows that resource wealth does not actually reach the country, the resource-rich country itself, but is accumulated in enclaves and then transported abroad. If we bring in Bevington in this debate, who states that yes, indeed, resource extraction creates many problems and it has to be channeled effectively to create inclusive resource-based development. And this should happen through taxes and royalties, corporate social responsibility of the extractive companies, and linkages creation. We can then enable social spending that then redistributes the resource wealth and targets the inequalities created by extractivism. And for all of this, so then drawing on Carl and also Bevington, getting the institutions right is essential. To make the most of resource abundance and to overcome negative impacts, a decisive role of the state and institutions is integral. But even if we overcome the resource curse and enclave extractivism and we get the institutions right, many voices in the extractivism literature call out extractivism in itself to be inherently predatory, with structural deficiencies that are continuously reproduced. So even if we move to neo or progressive or neo-developmental extractivism, whatever you want to call it, extractivism is also presented as an inherent cause of colonial features, according to Arak and Rabinovich, negative environmental and social impacts, according to Acosta, and also the connection between extractivism and capitalism in itself is already problematic. So Acosta, for instance, describes extractivism as a concept that helps explain plundering, accumulation, concentration, and colonial and neo-colonial devastation, as well as the evolution of modern capitalism and ideas of development and subdevelopment. Reference is also often made to Marx, but also Harvey's accumulation through dispossession. That being said, the purpose of this slide was to stress the complexities of extractivism that remain. Even if extractivism gets a new brush, the so-called what Arcel, Hohenbohm, and Pellegrini call extractivist imperative, that entails this idea that extraction needs to continue and expand, regardless how the circumstances might change. So no matter if we have neo-progressive extractivism, we still have extractivism that itself needs to continue. Right. Let's look at reforms in Sub-Saharan Africa. Campbell, so Bonnie Campbell, is particularly vocal about what she sees is the devastation caused by decades of neoliberal resource governance in Africa. And by that, she means the toll on poverty, eradication, and inequality, but also the unprecedented, profound impacts of what she calls the withdrawal of the state. Pressure from various actors for the sector to achieve more inclusiveness and address the implications of enclave extractivism and the resource curse phenomenon by creating greater linkages and diversification then emerged. And this pressure has translated into initiatives such as the 2003 World Bank Group Extractive Industries Review or the 2008 African Mining Vision. So the World Bank Review acknowledges deficiencies and declares more work on governance and good practices to achieve sustainable and inclusive resource-based development. And the African Mining Vision, which the African Union launched in 2009, is an initiative that can be seen as a neo-extractivist tool. The African Mining Vision's objective is that mining should become socially responsible and appreciated by surrounding communities. This entails the idea of the diversification of the industry and what they call resource-based African industrialization. So these multi-stakeholder initiatives that in many cases, like also in Guinea, went hand in hand with an increasing demand of the public to their respective governments to stand up and ensure that their countries benefit adequately from extraction, then translated into many national efforts. In this time, many mining codes were revised, contracts were revisited, and programs were launched to obtain more from the fruits of extractive activities. A very popular element of such reforms are so-called local content policies, LCPs. 90% of all resource-rich countries have some sort of LCPs, even if they're not explicitly aware of it. LCPs are a type of industrial policies that in itself are not new. We can connect them to Hirschman and Singer that I mentioned earlier, but also to ideas of protectionism, where an infant industry protectionism that was widespread in the 1900s, US and Europe. The main idea of LCPs is basically to go local, to turn the extractive industries into a diversified and local industry where as much direct and indirect employment, but also procurement of goods and services, as well as all activities up to export and beyond, should be sourced locally. We can recognize again the concept of linkages that can be traced back to Hirschman. It needs to be recognized that LCPs fall into the category of industrial policies that can be seen, depending on how they're executed, as protectionism, and in strict cases even resource nationalism. The strict LCPs are hence prohibited under World Trade Organization rules. The objectives of LCPs are to increase employment effects, which is vital, as in many resource-rich countries like in Guinea, unemployment remains a major issue due to the capital-intensive nature of extractive activities. And of course, the promised opportunities are inclusive resource-based development, and ideally this should also be channeled from increased government revenues from mining. Let's have a look at my case study now, Guinea. Since its independence from France, Guinea has been dependent on its bauxite industry. Bauxite is the raw material that is refined and smelted into aluminium. By 2025, Guinea aims to be the global #1 exporter of bauxite and alumina. In terms of the history of its bauxite extractivism, Guinea embodies many similarities of the discussion we just had. A developmentalist extractivist state post-independence, following their kind of version of African socialism under Touré. Then we saw neoliberal extractivism under Conté, where the main focus was to increase FDI and immediate financial returns. By the end of the 2000s, the voices in Guinea were louder to counter the perceived injustice of a lack of development impacts from the bauxite mining industry. And then following a new administration in 2010, the new government under Alpha Condé introduced a new, finalized and revised mining code in 2013. An integral part of the new Guinean mining code are local content policies. And my perception of what I learned from document analysis and fieldwork in Guinea last year is that there are two pillars of LCPs in Guinea. Firstly, we have laws and quotas in the mining code for mining companies. These quotas are voluntary without sanctions. The tables on the right show us what these quotas look like. Say you're a mining company in Guinea and you're operating in your second year of exploitation. The mining code will ask you that 60% of your senior executive employees should be Guinean and 100% of your non-qualified employees Guinean. Also, 15% of your small, medium-sized enterprises that you use as your suppliers and contractors should be Guinean. Moreover, you're asked to contribute by offering training and support programs for individuals and companies. This increase of Guinean capacities is so-called Guineanisation. The second pillar is what I see as indirect local content policies. The mining tax system in Guinea has been reformed and two new mining tax redistribution funds were created. This should channel mining revenues directly into the municipalities in Guinea. In the long term, this should also be used to create a more effective business environment to enable the creation of a diversified industry. I was interested to investigate the implementation of LCPs in Guinea's bauxite industry and to learn about the opportunities and obstacles, in particular by looking at the interactions of the actors, so mining companies and government in particular. What I found out from my semi-structured key format interviews was that a variety of obstacles was expressed. From institutional obstacles, i.e. a slow process to create all the legal application documents, but also challenges due to the law not being retroactive. So there's confusion as in if the older mining companies have to comply with these new legislations. There are also problems due to the inefficient business environment in Guinea, where local individuals and companies cannot really respond to the specific needs and requirements of the companies. But also some issues in the tax system means that foreign goods and services are in some cases cheaper than Guinean. Moreover, focusing on the actors, I found that the actors have different agendas, capacities, skills, and a different understanding and expectations from LCPs. There's a clash between local administrators and the national institutions based in Conakry, in the capital. So one of the administrators I spoke to in Conakry was frustrated and referred to the local administrators as children who do not want to listen to their papa, and hence do not execute and monitor LCPs. But I was also continuously told that this is not necessarily due to political motives and power dynamics, but also due to a lack of capacities. Some local mayors do not have the financial means and infrastructure to implement and monitor LCPs. Some of them are not even fully aware of the laws. Some mayors are illiterate and do not understand and speak French. And of course, the big elephant in the room was corruption. Some of my informants spoke of a chain of corruption from the local mayors to the préfecture and ultimately to the ministries. And it will need to be seen who benefits from local content policies and how transparent the whole process will be. And this is also what was expressed in conversation with 3 mining companies. They were worried about corruption and that the new institutions and platforms to execute LCPs may put their mining localities at a disadvantage. LCPs in Guinea are seen as a national project, whilst the mining companies seem to support closely their immediate areas that they see at a disadvantage if they have to compete with individuals and companies from the capital. Generally, the 2 new mining companies that I spoke with were very open and curious about these initiatives despite their reservations. However, it has to be said that in all 3 cases, the companies are very committed to their own corporate social responsibility initiatives. And in fact, all of them have exercised some sort of proto-local content policies that resembles the government initiatives a lot. They've created databases to boost local recruitment in their operations. They have trained individuals and companies, and they have followed their goal to increase Guineaization in their operations and beyond. And especially the oldest company, CBG, has put its own system in place since 1973 and has made their own arrangements with local municipalities. They see this return of the state with suspicion and do not want to abandon their CSR initiatives that they see as vital to ensure peace and acceptance in their areas. So what does all of this actually mean? We can identify numerous obstacles despite promising opportunities in mining sector reform implementation like LCPs. The Guinean experiences are not uncommon. They rather show deficiencies of LCPs that are continuously outlined in LCP literature. The obstacles already let us question the effectiveness of LCPs. Even if all obstacles were removed and opportunities would unfold, the structural inequalities of extractivism remain in place. In the case of Guinea, Knitzinger's work, for instance, shows how the transnational chains of commands, the dynamics of the industry complex of bauxite exploitation means that international private actors are more powerful than the government. And this is in line with findings by Ba and Diallo, who also show that actually in the past administrations, the bauxite industry has become a proxy state and obtained social contract rights from the state that undermine state legitimacy. And this is connected with Campbell's state withdrawal idea, as well as her view that structural inequalities surrounding the bauxite mining industry, so how contracts, prices, and negotiations take place, continue to remain in place. And this study's finding also show that particularly the established mining company in Guinea is not keen to give up this obtained autonomy. It is unclear if CSR initiatives and LCPs will continue to coexist or if they will somehow be reshaped, and more work is needed to investigate this dynamic. We see that extractivist activities, even if we call them new or neo or progressive or neo-developmental or whatever, remain complex, and we need to understand the history of extractivism and the legacy at least behind, like in this case, the retreat of the state that might seriously undermine LCP efforts. And even if perfectly executed, the same elites continue to benefit through the continuation of the commodity consensus and the extractive imperative. If we observe, for instance, Borchardt and Dietz's work, where they call this an elevator effect, they have observed actually that despite neo-extractivist policies in Latin America and redistribution, direct extraction rents remained in the same hands. Basically, all social groups have moved up, but the structural composition of society remained the same. And we need to continue to be cautious to observe if any real changes will occur. Now, the aim of this presentation was to explore and understand mining sector reforms in Sub-Saharan Africa and question their effectiveness in terms of the provision of inclusive resource-based development. I did this by focusing on LCPs in Guinea's bauxite industry. We dived into the history of extractivism and the obstacles and limitations of it that show the breadth of the extractivism puzzle. And we discussed that the proposed solutions need to be regarded with care. Seemingly simple proposals like getting the institutions right and returning power to institutions is actually more complex, and modifications to mining codes alone are difficult. I would propose thus to look at projects like LCPs with careful optimism, and I argue, based on my analysis, that LCPs should be one type of mining sector reforms that go alongside other deeper and more structural reforms. We should not shy away to question what the inherent implications of extractive activities are that need to be mitigated. I also believe that further research is absolutely vital. LCPs are relatively new and continue to be implemented. And now is the momentum where policy changes are made and evaluations occur. And research needs to keep an eye on how LCPs are implemented to hold stakeholders accountable and contribute to policymakers with useful modifications. We also need to understand how the history of extractive activities in each country may impact LCPs, particularly considering the role of the state and private sector that is integral in exercising any mining sector reform. This was it from my side. I thank you very much for tuning in today, and I'm very excited and I look forward to receiving your comments and suggestions. You can reach out to me via email, or you can also tweet. You can also have a look at my work. I've put some of my research outputs on ResearchGate. Yes, I'd be very, very happy to hear from you. As I pointed out before, this is work in progress that I'm still continuing throughout my PhD project, so I'd be happy to get some input. Thank you very much for tuning in today.